A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at some of the recent global defense assessments this morning, and it struck me how much the conversation has shifted since the early 2020s. It used to be that when people talked about military power, they were essentially just counting heads and tanks. But the landscape we are seeing here in early 2026 is fundamentally different. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the world's largest militaries by the numbers, specifically looking at personnel and air forces, and how those stacks look when you compare the United States and Israel to the rest of the world. It is a classic numbers game, but as we always say, the numbers only tell half the story if you do not understand the tech multipliers behind them. We are moving from the era of mass-based warfare into what I call the network-based era, and the gap between the two is becoming a chasm.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have been diving into the latest global firepower indices and the IISS military balance reports for 2026. You are right, Korn. The paradox of this year is that we have some of the largest standing armies in history in terms of raw personnel, yet the actual lethality and power projection of a nation often have an inverse relationship with the size of its payroll. When we look at the top 10 list for active duty personnel right now, the names at the top might surprise people who only focus on Western headlines. China still leads the pack with roughly 2 million active duty personnel, followed closely by India at around 1.45 million. The United States actually sits in third place with about 1.3 million active duty service members. But if you look at the paramilitary and reserve numbers, the picture gets even weirder. North Korea technically has the largest total military force if you count their paramilitary wings, totaling nearly 8 million people. But how many of those 8 million can actually operate in a modern electronic warfare environment? Probably less than 1%.
That is the core of Daniel's question, really. Are we measuring lethality, or just measuring a government's ability to issue uniforms? It is interesting that the US is third in headcount, but usually first in every other metric that actually determines the outcome of a conflict. You have these massive armies in the East, like North Korea or even Vietnam and Pakistan, which claim huge active duty numbers. But then you look at their logistical capabilities, or their technological integration, and it is like comparing a steam engine to a warp drive. I think what Daniel is getting at is how we should weigh these numbers. Is a soldier in 2026 the same unit of measurement across different borders?
Not at all. In fact, the concept of the soldier as a single unit of power is almost obsolete. We should really be talking about the network to soldier ratio. In the United States military, for every one infantryman on the front line, there is a logistical and technological tale of dozens of people and millions of dollars in software and hardware. When you look at the U.S. Army specifically, which is about 450,000 of that 1.3 million total, their real strength is not the number of boots, but the fact that those boots are connected to a real-time satellite-driven targeting grid. This is what the Pentagon calls the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2. By 2026, this system has matured to the point where a single squad leader in the Pacific can call in a precision strike from a submarine 500 miles away using a tablet. If you compare that to the North Korean or even the Iranian model, those are mass-based armies. They rely on the sheer volume of personnel to overwhelm an opponent, which is a 20th century strategy trying to survive in a 21st century world.
Let us talk about the Air Force side of Daniel's question, because that is where the US really starts to look like a statistical outlier. I saw a stat recently that if you took the US Air Force, the US Navy, and the US Army's aviation wing and ranked them as separate countries, they would occupy 3 of the top 4 spots globally for total aircraft. That is a staggering level of dominance.
The numbers are indeed staggering. As of this year, the United States operates over 13,000 aircraft across all its branches. To put that in perspective, the next closest is Russia with around 4,000 and China with about 3,300. But even those numbers are deceptive. When you dig into the 5th and 6th generation fighter counts, the U.S. lead is even more pronounced. The U.S. has over 600 F-35s in active service right now, plus the F-22 Raptor fleet. And we are now seeing the first operational wings of the next generation air dominance, or NGAD, platforms. China is trying to catch up with the J-20 and the J-35, but the operational readiness and the actual combat hours of those pilots are not even in the same league. Furthermore, the U.S. has moved heavily into the Collaborative Combat Aircraft, or CCA, program. These are the loyal wingman drones. So when you say the U.S. has 13,000 aircraft, that number is actually growing exponentially because each manned fighter is now acting as a mothership for 4 to 6 autonomous drones.
You mentioned operational readiness, and I think that is a huge point. You can have 5,000 planes in a hangar, but if you can only get 500 of them in the air at once because of maintenance or part shortages, your force size is a lie. This leads us naturally to the Middle East comparison Daniel asked about. Where does Israel sit in this mix? Because, on paper, Israel's active duty force looks tiny compared to its neighbors.
It really does. The Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, maintains an active duty strength of roughly 170,000 personnel. Compare that to Egypt, which has about 450,000 active duty troops, or Iran, which has over 600,000. If you just looked at a spreadsheet of active personnel, you would think Israel was at a massive disadvantage. But Israel's entire military doctrine is built on two things: rapid mobilization of reserves and a technological edge that acts as a force multiplier. We talked about this a bit in episode 585 regarding the citizen soldier model, but the 2026 data shows just how extreme that gap has become. Israel can go from a standing army of 170,000 to a fully mobilized force of over 570,000 in less than 72 hours. That is a reserve force of 400,000 people who are not just names on a list, but are trained, equipped, and integrated into the most advanced digital battlefield on Earth.
Right. And then you have the tech. We have to talk about the Iron Beam. We have been tracking the development of high-energy lasers for years, but in 2026, it is finally the primary layer of the Israeli defense umbrella.
The Iron Beam is the ultimate game changer for the 2026 defense landscape. For those who have not been following the technical specs, this is Israel's 100-kilowatt class laser defense system. For years, the Iron Dome was the gold standard, but it was expensive. You were firing a $50,000 Tamir interceptor to take down a $1,000 rocket. With the Iron Beam, the cost per interception has dropped to essentially the price of the electricity used to fire the laser, maybe $2 to $3 per shot. This completely breaks the economic warfare model that groups like Hezbollah or Iran were using. You cannot bankrupt a country that can shoot down your entire arsenal for the price of a couple of pizzas. This is a massive shift in the Middle East power dynamics because it removes the threat of saturation attacks. If you have enough power generation, you have an infinite magazine.
It turns the math of attrition on its head. If you are Iran and you are looking at the numbers Daniel asked about, you see your 600,000 soldiers and your thousands of proxy fighters, but then you realize that Israel's Air Force, which has about 600 aircraft including the custom F-35I Adir, can operate with near impunity because of their electronic warfare suites. The IDF essentially operates in a different dimension of warfare. While their neighbors are still focused on the number of tanks, Israel is focused on the number of sensors and the speed of the data link between a drone in the air and a tank on the ground. We discussed the broader context of these regional tensions back in episode 645, but the specific tech gap in 2026 is just wild.
And let us look at the regional air power comparison more closely. Egypt has a significant air force with over 1,000 aircraft, including F-16s and Rafales. Saudi Arabia has a very high-end fleet of around 900 aircraft, including F-15SAs and Typhoons. On paper, these are massive modern forces, but the difference is the indigenous integration. Israel does not just buy planes, they strip them down and put their own electronic warfare and command and control systems inside. That is why the Adir is so feared. It is a stealth platform that talks to every other asset in the Israeli theater in real time. In a regional conflict, the ability to see the battlefield first is worth more than having an extra 100 jets that are flying blind. Saudi Arabia has realized this, which is why they have been investing so heavily in their own domestic tech tail as part of Vision 2030, but they are still heavily reliant on foreign contractors for maintenance.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia, and I think that is an interesting case study for Daniel's prompt. They have one of the highest defense budgets in the world, often ranking in the top 5 globally, yet their active personnel count is around 260,000. They are the opposite of the Iranian model. They have high capital procurement, buying the best Western tech money can buy, but they struggle with the domestic technical tail to maintain it. So when we talk about the size of a military, are we talking about the number of people who can fix the plane or the number of people who can fly it?
That is the crucial distinction. In the US military, the ratio of support personnel to combat troops is roughly 7-1. Some people call it the tooth-to-tail ratio. A lot of critics say the US is too bloated, but that tail is what allows a carrier strike group to operate 10,000 miles from home for 6 months at a time. China and Russia do not have that kind of logistical reach yet. Their militaries are primarily regional. They are designed to defend their borders or bully their immediate neighbors. The US military, with its 1.3 million people, is the only force on Earth that can put a massive integrated combat force anywhere on the planet within 48 hours. That is a type of size that does not show up on a simple head count. In 2026, the US has also integrated AI-driven logistics in the Pacific Command, which has reduced the time it takes to move supplies by 40%. They are using autonomous cargo ships and drone swarms to keep the front lines fed.
I want to circle back to the drone factor because by 2026, this has become the great equalizer. We are seeing drone-to-pilot ratios shifting. It used to be 1 pilot for 1 plane. Now, we are looking at programs where one F-35 pilot might be controlling 6 or 8 autonomous combat drones. How does that affect our count of the largest militaries? If the US has 13,000 aircraft, but half of those are becoming autonomous or semi-autonomous, the lethality per human being in the cockpit is skyrocketing.
It makes the raw personnel count almost a vanity metric. If one US operator can manage a swarm of 50 drones, is that 1 soldier or is it 51? The current reporting standards still just count the human, which I think leads to a massive misunderstanding of modern power. For example, Turkey has become a massive drone superpower. Their personnel count is around 350,000, which is large for NATO, but their real power is their drone manufacturing and export capacity. They are changing the outcome of wars in North Africa and the Caucasus without sending a single infantry battalion across the border. In the Middle East, the proliferation of cheap, long-range drones has allowed smaller actors to punch way above their weight, but it has also forced the high-tech militaries like the US and Israel to develop the laser defenses we just talked about.
So if Daniel is looking at the Middle East, he is seeing this weird split. You have Iran with the mass personnel and the proxies, trying to use the 20th century human wave style of pressure. Then you have Saudi Arabia with the massive checkbook, but a smaller human footprint. And then you have Israel, which is the Goldilocks of the region. High-tech, highly integrated, and a massive reserve capacity that they can turn on like a light switch. It is a 3-way tug-of-war between mass, money, and brains.
And the US is the elephant in the room that has all 3. I think it is important to realize that the US Army, even at its current size of 450,000 active, is actually smaller than it has been in decades. They have intentionally traded size for readiness and tech. They would rather have a smaller force where every soldier has an integrated head-up display, a personal drone for reconnaissance, and a satellite link than 1 million soldiers with just a rifle and a helmet. That is the offset strategy that has been the cornerstone of US policy for a while now. They know they will never outpopulate China or India, so they have to outthink and outrange them. They are using things like the Integrated Visual Augmentation System, or IVAS, which gives every soldier night vision, thermal, and a digital map right on their goggles.
Is there a risk there, though? If you have this highly tuned, expensive, smaller force, can you handle a war of attrition? We saw in the early stages of the conflicts in the mid-20s that you burned through munitions and equipment, much faster than peacetime procurement allows for. If the US only has 1.3 million people and a major conflict breaks out in the Pacific, do we have the mass to actually hold territory?
That is the big debate right now in the Pentagon. There is a move toward what they call attritable systems. Basically, building drones and missiles that are cheap enough to lose in large numbers. This is the Replicator Initiative. Instead of $1 billion destroyer, you build 100 autonomous missile boats. It shifts the size of the military from the personnel office to the factory floor. In 2026, military power is increasingly being measured by your industrial capacity to replace lost autonomous systems, rather than your ability to draft 1 million more people. If you can print 10,000 drones a month, you are more powerful than a country with 10,000 extra soldiers.
That is a chilling thought in some ways. It turns war into a pure industrial output competition. If we look at the naval side of things, since Daniel asked about the largest militaries, we have to mention the Chinese Navy. They technically have more holes in the water than the US Navy now. I think the count is something like 3080 ships for China versus around 2095 for the US. Does that hole count matter as much as the tonnage?
Tonnage is the real metric. The US Navy still vastly outweighs the Chinese Navy because our ships are much larger and more capable. A single U.S. Ford-class carrier has more displacement and more strike power than the entire navies of most medium-sized countries. But the Chinese are building fast. Their Type 003 carrier, the Fujian, is now operational and using electromagnetic catapults. They are focusing on area denial, which means they do not need to match the U.S. globally, they just need to be bigger in their own backyard. This is the same thing we see in the Middle East with Iran's fast attack boats. They do not have a blue water navy, but they have enough small, explosive-laden drones and boats to make the Strait of Hormuz a nightmare for a large, expensive fleet.
It is the David versus Goliath dynamic, but David has a high-tech slingshot now. I think for the listeners, the takeaway from Daniel's prompt should be that the global firepower rankings you see on social media are often very misleading. They often rank North Korea or Pakistan very high because of their massive troop numbers. But in a real-world engagement with a force like Israel or the US, those numbers would melt away in the face of electronic warfare and long-range precision strikes. We saw this in the SITREP we did in episode 1117. Modern warfare happens at a speed and a range that makes the size of your infantry units almost secondary to the quality of your radar and your data links.
If you look at the Air Force fleet sizes specifically, the U.S. has more than 5,000 active combat aircraft. The next closest regional power in the Middle East is Egypt with about 1,100. But of those 1,100, how many can talk to each other? How many have active electronically scanned array radars? Probably less than 20%. Meanwhile, every single U.S. combat aircraft being produced today has that capability as a baseline. The gap is not just in the number of planes, it is in the generation of the technology inside them. And the US is already testing 7th generation concepts, while most of the world is still trying to figure out how to build a reliable 5th generation engine.
Let us touch on the nuclear side briefly, because that is the ultimate number that Daniel might be thinking of. The US and Russia still hold about 90% of the world's nuclear warheads, but China is in the middle of a massive breakout, aiming for over 1,000 warheads by the end of this decade. Does the size of a conventional army even matter when you have that kind of strategic umbrella?
It matters for everything short of total war. Most of the conflicts we are seeing in 2026 are in the gray zone: proxy wars, cyber attacks, and regional skirmishes where you cannot just flip the nuclear switch. That is why the U.S. maintains that 1.3 million person force. You need people to train allies, to secure ports, and to show the flag. You cannot do presence with a nuclear missile. You need a destroyer in the harbor or a battalion of Marines on the ground. The size of the military is a tool of diplomacy as much as it is a tool of war. And for Israel, that presence is their very existence. They do not have the luxury of distance.
When Israel looks at the Iranian personnel count of 600,000, they see a direct threat on their doorstep. That is why their air force is so aggressive. They have to be. They operate on the Begin Doctrine, which basically says Israel will not allow any enemy in the region to acquire weapons of mass destruction. To enforce that, you need the most capable air force in the world, pound for pound. And in 2026, that means the Adair fleet is constantly in the air, often undetected, monitoring every square inch of the region.
It is interesting to look at the F-35 Adir again in that context. Israel was the first country to use the F-35 in combat. They have integrated their own spice-guided bombs and their own data links. When we talk about the U.S. military being bigger, it is often because they provide the platform, but Israel provides the real-world stress test for that tech. It is a symbiotic relationship. The U.S. gets the data from Israel's combat experience, and Israel gets the massive industrial backing of the U.S. military-industrial complex.
So to answer Daniel's question about how much bigger the U.S. Army is, it is about 3 times the size of Israel's entire active duty force, and that is just the Army branch. If you count the whole U.S. military, it is nearly 8 times the size of the IDF. But when you factor in the Air Force, the U.S. is in a league of its own. There is no other force that can put 5,000 combat planes in the sky. And when you add the drones, that number effectively triples.
And that brings us to the logistical tailpoint again. The U.S. military employs over 700,000 civilians. These are the engineers, the analysts, the mechanics. If you add them to the 1.3 million active duty, you are talking about a 2 million person organization dedicated entirely to global security. That is the true scale. It is an organization the size of a large city, spread across every continent, working 24 hours a day. In 2026, the U.S. has also perfected the use of additive manufacturing, 3D printing at the front lines. They are printing spare parts for tanks in the middle of the desert. That is a type of size that is measured in capability, not just headcount.
I think a good takeaway for everyone listening is to start looking at technological readiness metrics instead of just personnel counts. When you see a headline saying Country X has the world's largest army, ask yourself what their drone-to-pilot ratio is. Ask yourself if they have a satellite constellation for targeting. If they do not, they are just a big target. The era of the citizen soldier is not over, but the role of that soldier has changed from being a rifleman to being a systems manager.
And watch the Iron Beam developments. As that technology matures and potentially gets exported or shared with the U.S., it will change the numbers game forever. If you can neutralize 1,000 missile swarm for the cost of a few gallons of diesel fuel to run a generator, the mass strategy of countries like Iran or North Korea becomes a historical curiosity rather than a credible threat. We are moving toward a world of directed energy and autonomous systems where the winner is the one with the best algorithms and the most reliable power grid.
It is a fascinating time to be tracking this stuff. The era of the mega army might not be over, but the era where the mega army was the undisputed king definitely is. We are moving into a world where a small, highly networked force can punch way above its weight class, and the US and Israel are the 2 primary architects of that new reality. Daniel, I hope that answers your prompt about the scale of these forces. It is not just about who has the most people. It is about who has the most people connected to the best machines.
We should also mention that for anyone interested in the deeper organizational theory of how the IDF manages this, episode 5085 is a great companion to this discussion. It really explains why that reserve model is so effective and how they maintain such a high level of training across the civilian population. It is the ultimate example of a hybrid army.
Well, I think we have given Daniel plenty to chew on there. It is a complex picture, but the trend line is clear. Fewer people, more sensors, and a lot more lasers.
It is the Poppleberry. Way, get the data, find the multiplier, and ignore the fluff.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to process all this global defense data in real time.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying these deep dives into the mechanics of global power, a quick review on your favorite podcast app really helps us reach more people who want to understand what is actually happening behind the headlines.
You can also find our full archive and all the ways to subscribe over at myweirdprompts.com. We will be back soon with more of Daniel's weird prompts and whatever else is shaking the world in 2026.
See you then.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth for man. keep weirding